One of the interesting things I've noticed over the years is that there's very little information or useful roadmaps, let's call it, for a new collector in how to begin a collection, where to go, what to look for, really anything. You know you love something, you're attracted to a particular subject in collecting, and we'll talk a lot about dolls in this case, but wow, there's a lot of information out there to sort through, a lot of different places to get it, and so much complexity, so many nuances, so many different things you hear. Where in the world do you begin? I get it. And there's been so little out there to help anyone in this process. There's no book that I know of here's what you do to start a collection. There is no website. There is nothing really other than you got to go out and figure it all out yourself. And that can be a daunting task. Now, I believe, and what I want to kind of bring into this conversation today is that I also think that this starting moment, these first few years, which really are critical into the long term, they can actually be the best years. This is when you are, as a collector, a sponge. It's like being a child. Everything you're curious about, everything is fascinating. But you're still left with the uncertainties, the need for validation, the did I do the right thing? Did I buy the right thing? What is the right thing? And I'm hoping today to kind of help you through understanding some good steps to take in this process, but as well recognizing that it's okay. It's okay to feel this way, and you will eventually come into a collector evolution, as I call it, that will, if you give it time, make you a great collector. So how do you even start? This is one of the things that's always fascinated me over the years in talking to collectors. And one of the first questions I always ask them is, what started it all? Because it's interesting to me from a market perspective, and it's interesting to me from an emotional idea of what it is that is the catalyst for collecting. You'll hear nostalgia a lot, and I talk about nostalgia a lot as being the trigger of something that is almost visceral into your past that you identify later as an adult, and you kind of want to relive that. Collectors of Star Wars action figures who were a child and grew up with Star Wars, or baseball cards who used to flip baseball cards as a young kid, and now they're collecting $5 million Honus Wagner cards. Nostalgia definitely is a big factor, but you would be surprised a lot of different things that will influence collectors' beginnings. And so I think the first thing to do is recognize how we start collecting and then take it from there. I love talking about Fran Cirola in San Diego, a dear friend who's been a collector for, oh my gosh, well, I can trace it back, I think 1968, because I know the story of it, how it all started. She's in her 90s now, has a fantastic home and collection in San Diego. And the beginning for her is kind of a fun one. Her husband, about the day before Christmas, was walking around town and desperately searching for, as most husbands are, a last-minute Christmas gift for his wife. So Chuck, that's Fran's husband, walked by the window of an antique shop and looked in, and there was an Armand Marseille 390 German doll. Now, for those in dolls, we all know the most common doll in the world from the German doll perspective. And he looked at that doll and he said, now, Fran was not a doll collector. Fran didn't even own a doll. But for some reason, Chuck looked at that doll and he thought, Fran would really like this, I think. So he walked in. He paid, I think, if I'm not mistaken, $65 for it at the time. And he brought it home and he wrapped it up. And on Christmas morning, Fran unpacked the box. And there's a photograph she still has of her face and just absolutely lighting up. It's the most beautiful photograph I've ever seen of a collector's first doll. And she loved it. She put it on the shelf and she looked at that doll every day for weeks after. And then, and I know collectors are already anticipating what came next. After about a month, she thought, well, that doll looks so lonely up there. And what is this doll? What's the story behind it? So she started digging through doll books, reading a little bit about antique dolls, discovering the Armand Marseille 390 information, German dolls, and the whole history of Bis dolls, what it was made of. And she was fascinated by it. Now, she didn't really think she was going to be a collector. She just wanted a friend for that AM 390. So she went off on her own and went to a local doll show in San Diego and decided she would go on a quest to find a friend for her AM 390. And she did. And she brought it home and she put it up there, another standard German Bis doll of the time, and loved how the two of them looked. And then she thought, well, why can't I have a whole group of little friends sitting up there? And so it went further and further, and it continued on to the point that Fran ended up building one of the top 10 collections in America, a fabulous collection of 1,000 dolls, valuation in the millions. And Chuck always jokes, and I love this, and we always laugh at it. He always jokes, that was, in the end, the most expensive $65 Christmas present a man could have ever purchased for his wife. So it shows you how everybody's beginning might be different. I mean, I know of the collector in Asia who I've worked with for years who started off with a Mary Hoyer doll. Very simple in the sense that he was given one as a young boy, came from a very privileged family, was very protected, and the doll was given to him sort of to be a friend when he was a child growing up with this Mary Hoyer. And then when he reached his teenage years, he obviously packed that doll away, kind of in quotation marks here, outgrew it, and he forgot about it. Until one day in his 40s, he was going through a lot of his old nostalgia childhood items, and he found that doll, and he became fascinated by it. And it brought back so many memories of how this doll was a friend to him during these times. And he decided to research, learn about it, and came to find that there were many different types of dolls. There were even rare French dolls and incredible German characters and all these different genres and French fashions. And he started falling in love with the subject of dolls once he learned the stories. And so he began collecting. Again, he wanted a friend. It all started out with this. He wanted a friend for his Mary Hoyer. It had to be 14 inches, the same size. And for years and years and years, this collector would only buy a doll. I am talking French ATs, Brews, H's, every imaginable dream doll of a collector. He would buy it if it was 14 inches. It had to fit Mary Hoyer. Now, luckily, I eventually talked him into understanding that, Mary could have friends that are different sizes. So he began expanding into 15, 16 inches, maybe 13 inches, but it had to kind of fit that scale. My point being, we all start for different reasons. And that journey through this collector evolution, those first few years, is the one that I do believe will impact directly your continuing on for a lifetime of collecting, and more importantly, have the happy life of a collector. Because it truly is an incredible, fantastic adventure. So where do you start? I think the first key in all of this for everyone is some of you, like Fran Cirola, will start by accident, that doll on Christmas, and then it just begins to build from there. Or the collector in Asia, who had a nostalgic, visceral drive to a childhood item and decided to expand on it there. Some of you might stumble onto a museum and see a doll and become fascinated by it. Some of you might read something online or even be on Pinterest and suddenly see all the doll dream boards on there of really fabulous French fashion dolls that you love costuming. So you instantly become interested in learning more about the subject. Everybody has different reasons. I think the first key in all of this is identifying what doll, what type of doll, what genre of dolls draws you in the most, and understanding what exactly is driving this emotional need. Nobody is looking at a doll as an investment. We've talked about this in the past. Nobody's saying, I want to invest in dolls. I don't care about dolls necessarily. I'm going to put them in a safe somewhere. No, you want to buy things that have appeal to you. So, what dolls have appeal to you? As I've said, some people it may be French fashions. You may like the whimsy of German characters or googlies or American composition dolls that have some direct relationship to your own history. Find that genre. Start there. Another collector I'll talk about here because I think she makes a great example in this theory is Hannah Buktis of Vienna, Austria. Hannah is, for me, the definitive collector who, if we could model a perfect process and evolution of a lifetime collecting, Hannah Buktis is your roadmap. She started off in, I would say, the 1970s, identifying, as many of us do, in the nostalgia of dolls. That is, she grew up during the war. There was a photograph or a history of her as a young girl holding a doll during a very difficult time, and that doll serving as comfort for her. And it wasn't until later on in life that she felt this connection and this need to understand more about this past and the emotions she felt. So she began identifying what was that doll that she had as a young girl. It was a German doll, clearly of the time. And she began to research and learn more about German dolls and started collecting there. And that was her focus for the first couple of years. Hannah Buktis, though, was she's passed away now, so I speak of her in the past tense, was a very structured person in her processes, very organized, very, as I've used the word before, pragmatic and tactful in her approach in collecting. So she began to learn everything she could about those German dolls. And she started collecting those. And then she reached a point after a few years that she discovered French bébés. And this was sort of the next stage, the next road in this journey. And she began learning everything she could about French bébés, reading books, talking to other collectors, going to museums, going to shows, and then embarked on a few years of collecting French bébés. At which point, she also discovered she loved miniature rooms, doll houses, and vignettes, room settings. So with that, she began to learn everything she could and spent a few more years reading, meeting other collectors of that genre, educating herself, and started buying and building one of the great collections in Europe of miniature rooms, doll houses, and vignettes. At which point, with the vignette leaning, she realized French fashions fit perfectly into the idea of these displays of miniature furniture. So she began to collect French fashions, but first taking a few years, learning everything about French fashions, the different bodies, what costumes are original, the different faces and different styles that you can find fashions in. What was good? What was more typical? She built an incredible collection, one of the greatest collections in the world of French fashion dolls. In that process, she then discovered Neapolitan creche figures of the 17th century. Well, they are ultimately three-dimensional figurative art, much in the way of a French fashion, with elaborate costumes of that particular period. She became fascinated by them. She started learning everything she could, talking to experts in the particular field, going to auctions, going to museums. It was lucky for her that the Bavaria Museum in Munich, just a few hours away, had one of the greatest collections in the world of these dolls. I say the term dolls. A lot of people argue with me that Neapolitan creche figures are not really dolls, but what is a doll? Let's call it figurative art. She discovered and began to buy and built probably the singular greatest collection of Neapolitan figures, or as Europeans like to call them, crib figures, in the world. And that was her final collection. So over 50 years picking a category, learning about that category, buying that category. One thing leads to another, and it does so gradually. That's why Hannah Buktis, in my mind, was the greatest collector in history in her ability to evolve over time like this. A lot of collectors, I think what ends up happening is they begin the process of collecting and they go off in 100 different tangents. They're so excited in the beginning, and I get that. It is exciting, but they don't seem to zero in on a particular sort of niche or subject or category to really gain experience within that and then expand later on. They go in full force, buy, buy, buy. And that's where a problem can occur. I know part of the joy of collecting is the hunt and the buying. I get that this is exciting for many people, but collecting through the process of elimination is not going to work well in the long run. Now, what does that mean? Collecting by the process of elimination. That means collecting with no real sense of direction, no real understanding of where you're going with this, no real category that you are educating yourself on and really developing experience with, that you can buy in a gradual, very tactful, pragmatic manner. This is important because it disciplines you to be very discerning about what you're buying. It disciplines you to really take a hard look at every object. And it helps you to avoid collecting through the process of elimination, in which you later on have to sell items from your collection because you realize, oh, as you always heard, and I hear this all the time in collection, oh, those dolls over there, don't pay any attention to those. Those were the things I bought in the beginning. Don't buy those. There's no reason now in this day and age that you cannot go at a really good pace. And here's another interesting sideline about this. It's good not to go too fast because you could potentially actually ruin the joy of collecting for yourself. Lucy Morgan was a great lesson in this. Now, I love Lucy, no pun on the old TV show, but Lucy was fantastic. Lucy Morgan came into the market in the late 90s. She had a lot of available funds, loved dolls, was a fairly quick learner, but immediately was impacting the market in ways we have never seen before. Lucy wanted the best of everything. She loved German characters. She loved French fashion. She loved bébés. She loved it all, early porcelains, everything. So anything good in any category within antique, she would grab it. She would buy it. 5 years later, after Lucy was the most talked about collector in the world, she calls me one morning and she tells me she wants to sell her collection. I said, Lucy, are you okay? You've been collecting like 5 or 6 years. What do you mean you want to sell your collection? She said, Stuart, I don't know. I go up to the doll room now and I look around and I see what's coming up on the marketplace and I realize I have it all. There's nothing left for me to get. So I figure I might as well sell. And it was a really poignant moment in my career in understanding that getting everything you want really fast can actually work in reverse in maintaining the possibility of having a really true long life in collecting. I always say too that in many cases, this is why collectors should not get everything they've ever wanted. I always joke, may there always be that one doll you never get. Why? Because it just keeps you going. It keeps you involved. It keeps you in the hunt, and that's the joy. So it's interesting that not only is the concept of buy right in the beginning dangerous in that you really haven't gathered enough information yet to effectively do it, and probably are going to be buying things you're going to sell later on, that process of elimination, but you're kind of taking the whole joy out of collecting, which is doing it gradually in a, as I said, pragmatic manner, that allows for a full life of it and a lot more fun. So, what do you do? How do you actually start a collection in this way that I have talked about that is a bit more strategic? Well, the first is, as I said, you want to pick a category. You want to find that category that really makes your heart sing, and you want to start immersing in what I call the deep dive of everything you can learn about it. Now, the internet is a fabulous place for you to begin, but the internet, I want to caution you, is not everything out there. It will give you a foundation in which to learn different nuances, to understand some of the historical background. But like everything on the internet, you have to dissect it carefully. I mean, if the self-diagnosing on the internet is always a fun one to compare it to. Everybody here, I'm sure, has spent years self-diagnosing different things online that they find. And God knows I have too as well. And if I believed everything on the health sites that I've ever read in a self-diagnosing moment that I've had, I'd probably have died 86 times since. So now you might say, but Stuart, this is the internet your podcast is on. I'm not supposed to believe anything you say? Well, yes, you are. No, I'm joking. You're supposed to take what you hear me talking about and dissect it to fit within the context of your collecting. Some things you'll agree with me on, some things you won't, but it's all part of that process. The other thing that really is intriguing about being a beginner, starting collecting, and being on the internet is that many of the discussions out there online, many of the YouTube videos, many of the online forums, you're dealing with collectors who have probably been in this subject, in this hobby for 30 years. And so they can talk in ways and about things that might be confusing to you as a beginner. Now, they make perfect sense to them and to the others that have been collecting that long, but to you, it could be almost too much information all at once. So, being a beginner, not only going on the internet and researching, but choosing what is correct for you and is laying out things in a basic sense to help you in the process of evolving gradually so that you'll understand the more complex discussions later on. But look, the internet is only as good as this base knowledge and understanding of highly complex nuances. It can't teach you everything. Marianne Cieslik, who I've admired for years, one of the leading researchers in the world, primarily on German dolls and also teddy bears, she was having dinner with Florence Theriault, the founder of our company, some years ago. And this is somebody who's been in dolls as long as Florence, written some of the most definitive books, including the German Doll Encyclopedia. And she said to Florence, "I envy you so much." And Florence was like, "Marianne, why? You get to actually see and touch so many dolls. I would dream in my research to be able to have that access." And it occurred to Florence at that time that Marianne, as a researcher, wasn't necessarily around the dolls physically as much as she was. And as such, she felt like she was missing a certain part, and why they actually teamed up for years in the discussion and research of German dolls, because Florence had that other part of it that was so important. She had the tangible, the tactile touching, the looking at the dolls closely in real life, not in a photograph, not in a documented historical paper, not on the internet. She was actually holding it. One of the collectors I admire, Catherine Peterson in South Carolina, she wrote something that really struck me a few years ago. And it made me understand and realize that in the process of learning about dolls, really the process of collecting your whole life, seeing a doll, holding a doll means everything in the ability to know, do you really love that doll? Catherine wrote what she called the weight of a doll. And that is that she picked up this one doll and she held it in her hands. And the simple weight of that doll in her hands had this emotional connection to her that she knew she had to have it. And that, to me, led beyond just the ability to look at it and see unique features, as I've often said, nuances, to see details, but also just to feel the connection of how it relates to you in that weight. So all the research you do on the internet will never compare, and all the things you do to learn about doll collecting will never truly give you your best feet forward in comparison to going out and actually seeing dolls firsthand in different circumstances, in collectors' homes, in doll shows, in auctions, museums, everywhere that you can potentially look and see a doll. You should be going. Yes, I'm saying get out of the house. It's good. I know that society is changing so much, and so much we're relying on virtual experiences, even our own auctions, as a matter of fact. But really, I think that it is adding a layer of more complexity to your evolution in collecting, and it is not giving you the training that a lot of collectors need in firsthand really experiencing dolls up close and personal. So get out. It's okay. So what do you see if you get out? What do you see and experience that's so different than looking at a doll online? We talked about the weight, the emotional connection for sure, but I always use the example of collectors who also made dolls over the years. So in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, it was a huge trend in reproduction doll making. So what's interesting is a lot of these people were also antique doll collectors, but they found a joy in the hobby of recreating antique dolls through the molds and doing the painting. And for them, if you talk to many of them, and I spoke at a lot of the conferences over the years of these reproduction doll artists and the competitions, the joy of this was not as much the creation part of it. The joy was they got to see and experience exactly the detail work that was done in painting these dolls. They would argue over every little detail on a face, the strokes of eyelashes, the eyebrows and the thickness and the differences that were out there in the dolls. And they really knew how to identify a great face, a great look, a great presence on an antique doll because they were so immersed in this process of looking at the details. What I would say just a doll collector who likes beautiful objects in their home sees a doll, they might look at a bigger picture of that doll. How would it display? How does it look in the big picture? But they don't necessarily go in and say, oh, let me take a look very carefully at these brush strokes. I want to see if they're even. I want to see how many there are. This is what the reproduction artists did, and they were fantastic. They built some of the greatest collections in Australia and Japan, where a lot of incredible doll artists emerged during that period. There were fabulous antique doll collections because they had developed such a great eye. And they didn't do that just from books. They didn't do that just from the internet. They did it because they would go out, and you could always see them at the auctions. They would be going in and looking so closely at the face, and they would be making little notes about it. And that is one example of how being out there and really looking at a doll can make all the difference in your understanding a lot of the details to be able to identify presence. Identifying presence is probably the greatest benefit of experience and a gradual process of education in dolls to build a great collection. You can't train this. You can't teach somebody to recognize greatness right off the bat. There are a few exceptions of people who just seem to have a knack, but for most collectors, it takes time. You've heard me talk before about the 10,000 hours that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about in one of his books, that it is an important process in having a real true label of expert. And you can't explain why you can do the things you do, why you see the things you do. You just do out of experience. And that begins with getting out there and getting your 10,000 hours in of direct exposure to dolls in a real moment, not internet based. Another great step for collectors, an important part of this process, is community. And this is something that's interesting because in many ways, more and more community is there. And in a lot of ways, we are losing a sense of community. So how is this different? Community has developed, of course, online. And we have thousands of online communities right now that are developing within collecting. Certainly within doll collecting, you have Facebook groups and Zoom clubs and all sorts of different collectors from around the world who gather in their little social circles. You have, I know Tammy Trujillo, my producer, has a whole club for composition doll collectors, as a matter of fact, on Facebook. So you can join these communities and you can be part of them. That's great. I love online communities, and I think it is a fabulous future for collecting and ways for people to connect. But again, you're still not getting that real exposure. So I think joining doll clubs, though it may seem like a thing of the past, should become part of the future again. So I think they both can go hand in hand. I see no reason that you can't belong to 20 different groups online, develop community within there, develop experiences and sharing of dolls online, but as well joining local clubs where you can go and experience collections firsthand, talk to other collectors, be inspired, listen to them. These are also really important moments in your evolution. You don't have to agree with everything they say. You don't have to collect everything they collect, but everybody can learn something from everyone else. And I think the in-person doll clubs are really important, and why UFDC, in my opinion, is the most important organization out there. And you ask why. What do they do? Well, they do unbelievable things in the education for doll collectors, in building community for collectors. The UFDC Museum serves as a central, wonderful place to preserve the art of doll for everyone to be able to witness and enjoy. But more than that, I always break it down into some simple concept. When we're all gone, this whole generation of collectors, UFDC will go on. And the foundation that it has built in the education of collecting will continue if we support it. And that is, and organizations like UFDC are the place where a lot of beginning collectors can go, find a home, find community, and experience education. And this is why it is so critical that we continue to support them, because if you are a beginning collector right now, it is probably the best place you can go to learn more and gain some footing in the idea of education and dolls in your future. You know, buy some old doll books. This is another piece of advice that I love giving collectors, because you tend to look at everything online, but I'm always fascinated by the old doll books, because a lot of the information in these old books never really made it online. Now, a lot of it may not be accurate, but it's kind of an interesting study and look at the evolution of collecting and the evolution of the information on dolls that happened over the years. And it may help point out certain terms that are used in doll collecting today and how they originated. So you could actually find old doll books all over in collections and being sold in used bookstores, or even if you join, again, community. One of the advantages you have in doll clubs is You might have a collector who doesn't want her old doll books anymore, or has too many duplicates, or needs to make space, or is moving, whatever, and says, here, can you take them? You should. And you should utilize them and look through them and read them, not to necessarily decide what information may be right or wrong in today's world, but to learn how we have evolved and where the original information came from, and to pay respect to some of these early researchers and what they came out with. This is all part of this education, and it's a great, great thing to do, and it's very inexpensive to go out and find these old doll books. So being a new collector is an incredible experience. This may be the most exciting and fantastic period of your life in collecting, and it should be a lifetime. The greatest advice I can give you to this moment is really feel and experience the emotions of what you're going through. Really enjoy this time and keep it close to you. Remember it. A lot of people in their process of collecting over 30, 40 years maybe, they tend to lose that energy and excitement over time that they had in the beginning. And I think a lot of it is that they don't stay humble. You get to a point where you think you know it all. You've learned everything. And I believe staying humble and staying true to yourself and keeping the energy of what it felt like to be a new collector and the excitement of looking at everything and seeing, oh my gosh, so many beautiful things that you wanted and all, this is what you need to keep close. That will keep the energy going, and it will keep you humble in the long run. If you are humble, you will learn, even after 30 years, 40 years of collecting, you will keep learning. If you don't, if you feel you know it all, you will close yourself off to all of the new information, all of the new discoveries, and the ability to say, you know, what Florence, my mentor in this, has always said, never say never and never say always. Everything is possible in the historical context of dolls. Everything could be uncovered. New things may come out, new information. Florence will tell you, after 55 years in this business, after millions of dolls that have passed through her hand over these years, she is the first to reveal to you that she's learning something new every day. She does it by staying as humble as possible to the information and realizing that new things come out. We learn about new types of dolls and new variations, and we learn new history, and to be open to that. And you can only do that if you keep that same spirit of that new collector that you are within you for decades. Be that sponge. And finally, my advice to new collectors is to never lose sight of collecting, and the dolls should be an extension of you. That is your taste, your love, your desires, formed gradually over time through proper education, experience, immersion, community, that you are able to then create within yourself your idea of what a collection should be, and it should extend from you. Don't let others tell you what you should collect. Don't let others define for you what you should love. Take the time now as this new collector to really gain that ability yourself, to identify with dolls in your way, and to express to others what they mean to you, what is important to you, what you're passionate about, and say, this is my collection. Let me tell you the story of each.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media, and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault, or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriault.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.